Hello again. This is the third and final session in our Chanukah series. You'll recall that over the last 2 weeks we've looked at various aspects of Chanukah. Last week we looked at Chanukah as the origins of modern Judaism. In the first week, 2 weeks ago, we considered why Chanukah should actually be 8 days rather than 7. And this week we're going to do something completely different. It's already Chanukah. We're already celebrating. Hope you're having a wonderful time. And we're going to go to a text which helps us to consider the following question. What shape is your menorah? Now, this might seem to be a trivial or uninteresting question, but nonetheless, we're going to do our best to turn it into something interesting, which actually has a broader application than simply a small question about the shape of a menorah. So I think depending on who you are, if you're listening, you may already know the answer to this question, which is it's either round or it's not round, and I'll explain what I mean. Now, a Chanukah menorah is of course based, at least loosely, on the menorah in the temple. The temple menorah had 7 branches, and that's the symbol of the state of Israel. The Chanukah menorah, of course, has 8 branches plus an extra one as a shamash to cast additional light, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago. And so there are no real rules other than it must have 8 slots and they need to be on the same level. You can make the menorah out of pretty much any material and with many designs, and it's been one of the greatest areas of creativity for Jewish artists, making Jewish ritual objects. But nonetheless, the idea of the menorah and its outline shape finds its origins in the menorah, which was in the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, and then in the temple. So let's look at this. Here we have your source sheet. I hope you can see it. You can also download it from the US website. V'asisa menorahs zahav tahor. I won't read it all in Hebrew, but in the instructions to build the Mishkan and its utensils, in the 25th chapter of the book of Shemos, Exodus, you shall make a menorah of pure gold, mikshah te'oseh ha-menorah. This menorah should be made from beaten metal, meaning it's a single piece of metal. That's something we touched on last week. Why it's significant, it's not pieces of metal welded together. All of its various pieces, the base, the shaft, the cups, its kind of bowl-shaped calyxes, as they are correctly called in this translation, and petals of all of one piece. We'll see a rudimentary diagram shortly of the menorah, but it was clearly quite a complex design. And it goes on to say, and I'll read in the English, 6 branches shall issue from its sides, 3 branches from one side of the lampstand. I've made the pointer a little larger, so I hope you can see that more easily. And 3 branches on the other side of the lampstand. On one branch, there should be 3 cups shaped like almond blossoms, and so on it goes on. It explains that there are various cups, calyxes, and petals on each of the 6 branches and on the central shaft. And there's a lot of detail. I don't think we need to read all of it. Most importantly, their calyxes and their stems will be of one piece with it, the whole of it a single piece of pure gold. So they start off with a lump of gold and with very skilled work draw out the arms and the various decorative additions, the adornments from a single piece of metal. It shall be made, and here I'm going to go back to the Hebrew. Kikar zahav tahor ya'aseh, so you shall make it from a single kikar, that's a certain volume, a talent of pure gold, with all of these utensils, meaning all of the bits and pieces that are described in this passage. Urev aseh, you should see, this is God speaking to Moses, va'aseh, and make it the savnisom in accordance with the images asher atah moreh bahar, that you are shown on the mountain. And the rabbis point out that it's extraordinarily complicated to visualize this menorah. In fact, we are only able to visualize it because we're familiar with it already. Moshe had some difficulty understanding it, and God had to show him an image of the menorah, as it were, up there in the mountain, so he knew what to work from and was able to describe it to the artisans who eventually crafted it. That's the basic passage, and you can see, as we'd expect, it has a central shaft with 6 lateral shafts. Our Chanukah menorah has 8, for reasons we've discussed previously. So far, so not terribly exciting, until you move to the commentary of the Rambam on the Mishnah. Now, in the tractate Menachos, which deals with mostly with meal offerings, not something which is so widely studied in our circles, there's a digression, and it starts talking about the way the menorah was constructed in the Mishnah, And the Rambam offers a commentary on this Mishnah, which was originally written in Arabic and then later translated into Hebrew. And here, I'm going to scroll the text up. You can see the Rambam's commentary. I'm interested in a little bit of the commentary, which is quite long, and I've culled it. But I'm interested primarily in one of the most famous diagrams of medieval Jewish literature, which I've reproduced here, and I hope you can see it. I made it quite large. So first, the text, before we look at the exciting bit, which is not the text at all, it's the picture. For Omru Bashir Gavoya. So the rabbis tell you a little bit about the correct, how to understand the height of the menorah. And it goes on, and I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it. It's 18 handbreadths high, and it goes on to explain how you manage to get the base and the stand and the various petals and cups and calyxes in. Right. Shnei konim yotzim mimenu echad lekan ve'echad lekan nimshachim va'olim keneged gavor shel menorah. So there's a central shaft, and I'm interested in saying there are two branches that emerge and go up to the same height as the rest of the menorah, i.e. as the central shaft, and then it continues, and another two a bit further down, and another two and a little bit further down. So we can see, as you'd expected, that the 6 branches emerge from the central shaft, 3 on each side. And just the last bit of Hebrew before I say what I've really brought. This is not so exciting so far. From the way we have depicted it, says the Rambam, you can understand the whole thing really quite easily. It's quite self-explanatory. This picture appears in all editions of the Rambam's printed version of his commentary. Now, of course, the Rambam was writing before printing, which was invented in the 15th century. This is a hand-drawn diagram made by the Rambam itself. I'm sorry about the background, this stuff here, but that's because that's the way it comes off the press. There's not much I can do about it. But the Rambam, as you can see, is not an accurate diagram, but you can see there are the circles and the triangles and the shapes here. These are referring to the cups, the calyxes, and the petals, and these are the 3 lateral branches which end at the same level as the central branch. This is the Rambam's drawing, and it's extraordinary. This is drawn, we understand, by the Rambam himself, who has said, look, I've got a little picture so you can understand it. What is remarkable about this picture is that, at least to the naked eye, without any kind of further explanation, the Rambam has drawn the branches straight, which means they rise diagonally from the central shaft, and they reach the level of the menorah, which means you see there are 3 diagonal lines on each side. Not how we have customarily thought of the menorah. And in case this seems a little unfamiliar, we are going to skip in a moment down to here, just to Rashi. I'm going to come back and look at the sources above in a moment. Rashi here explaining the text. Yotzim mitzideho. The text says that the branches emerge from its side. Lekan or lekan ba'al-chsoin. On each side, al-chsoin means slanting, slantwise or diagonally. They would ascend until they were equal in height to the central shaft. This is the key point. It would appear that Rashi validates the Rambam's understanding of the way the branches were to rise. Are they rounded, as we're familiar with many menorahs? No, they are straight. And al-chasam means a diagonal or slantwise. Now, this is somewhat unfamiliar, unless, of course, you are used to seeing Lubavitch menorahs, and we're going to see a little discussion of that in a moment. And the Lubavitch movement has taken it upon themselves to place menorahs in many public spaces, and you will have noticed that every menorah created by Lubavitch has straight arms, and in some way or other resembles the picture in the Rambam. And you can understand that. Chabad are quite enthusiastic about the Rambam, and this is a perfectly reasonable reading of the Rambam, that the branches should be straight. Of course, this assumes that the Rambam was drawing this picture so that you should understand that the arms were straight. It may have been too difficult for him to draw round arms. He may have believed there were round arms, but drew this as a picture. Nonetheless, you can understand that it's not an unreasonable depiction to create a menorah with straight arms. And as I said, that has become very popular in the Lubavitch movement. More of that in a moment. Now, before we move on to that, I want to show you something quite interesting here. Is there an alternative view? And the answer is yes. But we're going to get there very shortly. Here's a bit more diagonal stuff. So the commentary of the son of the Rambam did not write, or certainly we do not have, a systematic commentary on the Torah. We have his philosophical works, his commentaries on the Mishnah, and so on. But his son, Avram, known as Avram ben HaRambam, Avram the son of the Rambam, did write a Torah commentary, of which we have extant, Bereshis, and Shemais, his commentaries on Exodus, on Genesis and Exodus. And he comments on his father's comment to the Mishnah here in source 3, Nimshochim begufa shel menorah letzad rosh Yosef. They would go from the body of the menorah, that's the central shaft, straight to the top. As my father depicted it. And this is our source for knowing that the drawing we've just looked at was in fact drawn by the Rambam himself, because it's validated by his son. And in case you were in any doubt, lo be'igel kamoshet sir ose zulosai, and they are not rounded or semicircular, hemicircular, however you want to describe them, as they have been depicted by others. So for the avoidance of doubt, the Rambam's son says my father meant that they go straight and they are not rounded. And in a work, obscure work by someone called Rabbi Emanuel Ricci, who was an Italian late medieval commentator, he writes about the Rambam's commentary, and then we're going to move on from the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't actually mention that the arms were diagonal or straight, as Rashi does explicitly. As I mentioned, you have this word here in which Rashi explicitly mentions the notion of being diagonal. Ela kosov v'nimshochim v'oilin. He actually writes they would extend and ascend. As appears in the Brisa of Melechas HaMishkan in the Talmud, in early rabbinic sources, that is a phrase which appears in the Rambam as borrowed it. So what? But he quotes a work called Kosav Bal Chochmas HaMishkan, the author of a work which I'm not familiar with, called The Wisdom of the Mishkan, says the branches were made in a kind of circle. Now, I don't know whether that means that in a two-dimensional plane, they were semicircular, as we're about to see, or whether he means that it's a three-dimensional circle, so that in a rather pre-modern depiction, if you were to look from the top of the menorah, you would see that the branches were arranged in a semicircle, because in a circle positioned round a certain Y, because they represent an early depiction of the Shive Kochve Lekhes, meaning the seven planetary systems. How you could look in the sky and see the system, and for some reason which is not explored here, the individual lamps of the menorah represented the planetary system. So there are two ways of understanding what a circle might be. You could still have diagonal branches, but if you looked from above, they were arranged in a circle to represent the planetary system, or it could mean that the branches were directed in a two-dimensional plane. There is some unclarity about this. We've seen the Rashi already, but I want to show you we've seen the counterpoint. Now, the Ibn Ezra, perhaps the greatest grammarian who comments systematically on the Torah text, Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, who lived only slightly after Rashi and before the Rambam, is very much a proponent of the round-armed model. Right? Egulim, aruchim, chalulim. He says that they were circular, round, long, and hollow. What does this say? It's Nerasechel, the lamps. So the early sources tell us there was a single lamp in the middle, and the other six were arranged one after the other, means as it were in a line, in a semicircle. So it seems pretty certain that the Ibn Ezra understood that the menorah was, as we're more familiar with, a set of three interlocking or concentric semicircles. That's what we're familiar with. And so you can see that this is an unresolved disagreement. Almost certainly the Rambam holds that the branches were diagonal, they were straight, and the Ibn Ezra absolutely clearly holds that the branches were semicircles. So what do we say about this, and why am I bothering to tell you about what is a very obscure disagreement? We don't have any photographs, We do not have the original artifact. And there are many claims that have been perpetuated over the years that the original menorah was taken to Rome, and somehow still may exist in the Vatican vaults. I think this is wishful thinking. But nonetheless, you may recognize this picture, which is the most famous depiction of history of the menorah. This is an image from the triumphal Arch of Titus, which was built to celebrate the destruction of Jerusalem, the sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans under the reign of Titus, around the year 70 AD. And the menorah is depicted with round arms. Of course, this is a detail. Many of you may have seen it. I must say, on my own trip to Rome, which was very brief, I did not get a chance to see it. I've never actually been there. But this is a depiction, and it's clearly showing the Romans carrying off the spoils, of which perhaps the most beautiful, the most emblematic item, as it were, of the Roman victory over the Jews is carrying off this menorah. You'll notice straight away this menorah cannot be 18 handbreadths high, and perhaps it's not depicted to scale, or maybe it's something else altogether. But we see now that we have two depictions, both of quite ancient vintage. One validating the view that it is diagonal, like Rashi, the picture of the Rambam, which of course that's from the 12th century, and now we have the depiction from the 1st century carved on the Arch of Titus. So let's continue. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was, let's say, a strong preference amongst Chabad, in Lubavitch, to follow the view of the Rambam that the menorah had straight arms, and to place those menorahs all over the place as a kind of Jewish symbol. If one lives in a Jewish area, one can hardly fail to notice them. They are all over the place. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zichron Livrocha, wrote about this issue, and I think spoke about it too. Here is what he says about it. It was a long piece, and I have culled it. Interesting, whether we feel that this is a credible argument or not. I'm just going to give you one moment. I can see that it's rather bright behind. Let me just address that. Please hold on a second. I hope that's a little better. And here we go. Source 8. I'm going to scroll it up. I've got some bullet points which capture the Hebrew text. The usual depiction of a menorah shows it with the 6 branches forming semicircles. Where did that come from? According to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who alpi hashor chikui b'tzir hamenorah asher lo Yehudim tziru baromi va'al shar nitzochen shel Titus yimach shemoi. This has been based on extracting information from depictions of the menorah that are not Jewish in origin, and particularly the one that the Romans depicted on the Victory Arch of Titus, of which we've just seen an image. When Titus, the wicked one, destroyed the temple, he instructed his troops that they should sack the temple and bring its spoils to Rome. And in honor of this wicked man, they built a victory arch or victory gate in Rome, which carries his name, Titus, the Arch of Titus. And in that arch is depicted bearing away the utensils from the temple, which were captured, and among them is the menorah. And in the depiction of the menorah that is on the Arch of Titus, the 6 branches of the menorah are depicted as a semicircle. It is a completely inaccurate depiction. So he now makes a controversial observation with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is, it is self-evident that this is not an accurate depiction. It is a controlling, victorious depiction, the dance of the victor, to demonstrate that they have established dominion over the Jews, such, and the words Yehudim Shavuim, the Jews have been captured, is very much part of the narrative of this depiction. And he makes various observations. It was well known that Jews they weren't allowed to go to this arch, or they had to pay a special tax, and so on. It seems then that the depiction of the menorah as a half semicircle, it should make us very anguished and distressed, because it's a symbol of the destruction of the temple and of the victory of the Romans over the Jews in the year 70, quite apart from the fact, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that it says explicitly in Rashi and the Rambam that it's not to be drawn like this. Right? What that means to say, and this is the controversial point, is that the way it's depicted is inaccurate deliberately in order that Tsar Yehudim v'Ashpilon, in order to distress the Jews and to make us and to grade us. This Tamuras in contrast, the type of menorah that reminds us of our responsibility to be a light to the nations, we must make according to the correct Jewish depiction, which will, as it were, subvert this non-Jewish depiction, that we can be victorious when they were victorious. And that means we have to light a menorah that in his view is the appropriate shape, which is the shape depicted by the Rambam and described by Rashi, as we saw in the first few sources. I think the controversial part of this is an assumption that the depiction, which would ordinarily be regarded as historically and archaeologically significant, is deliberately subverted to be a non-Jewish picture to indicate the subjugation of the Jewish captives. For me, this has no evidence at all, other than that the Rambam depicts the menorah differently. And I think it's actually very clever. What has happened is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe has succeeded, certainly among his followers, of creating a sense that this menorah represents Jewish victory, Jewish success, Jewish pride, if you like. And as such, wants people to place it everywhere. It's got a product placement all over the place as a symbol of the light to the nations. Whether historically this is correct, given that virtually every ancient depiction in mosaic, on arches, and in every other possible way, depicts the menorah with round arches, even when there is no element of victory as described by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, makes this historic claim, in my view, very suspicious. So this brings us really to the whole point of this talk. Why have I bothered to spend 20 minutes of your time so far discussing an entirely academic and unprovable point? Is the menorah of the temple correctly made with straight arms or with rounded arms? Who cares? Does it really matter? And I also, given that until such time as we uncover the original menorah buried deep under Jerusalem or wherever it may be, if that even happens, we have no way of permanently and, as it were, irrefutably resolving the disagreement. It seems to be the sort of things that rabbis occupy rather too much time, purely academic, and perhaps not terribly exciting or purposeful discussion. Does it really make any difference? Given that there are no halachic consequences of this, the Lubavitcher Rebbe may well recommend making a Rambam menorah with straight arms, but the halacha does not require such a menorah. You can make a menorah from almost any material, as long as it's dignified, as long as it's arranged and aligned, so it's clear each night how many candles are being lit. I'm reminded of my yeshiva days in Gateshead, where someone who may even be listening to this class right now bought 9 bottles of Nuki Brown ale, probably drank them, and then lined up the 8 bottles with a 9th one on a red in the window of his room in Gateshead Yeshiva, facing the street, and put oil in the top and used this as a menorah, of course, until the yeshiva asked him to remove it because he felt it was inappropriate. However, it's a perfectly kosher menorah. You can make a menorah for almost anything. So this discussion about the shape of the menorah, what shape is your menorah, the question for my last class in this series, seems to be entirely academic. But it teaches us a really, really interesting principle, one which I think is much more important than the narrow issue we're discussing. And that is something that is discussed in a really fascinating essay, the last source I have here, from a letter written by the late, great Rabbi Yitzchok Hutner. Rabbi Hutner was an extraordinary Torah teacher and a prolific writer and thinker, a man who went through many phases in his life. He was originally a student of Rav Kook, and later in life became a very much an advocate for a certain Haredi way of thinking, and he became a Gera Chassid, perhaps was always from that world. And Rav Hutner is best remembered for his extraordinary writings, which are collected by his daughter in volumes called Pachad Yitzchok, and there is a volume of letters. And in his letter 30, he talks about the value of these type of discussions. And here I will, as it were, perhaps have to admit something to you, which is that one of my particular passions is hermeneutics. In fact, I have a PhD in hermeneutics, if you ever wonder what the doctor stands for in the little thing below my name. And that means I'm interested in the way texts are read, how they're being understood, what the agenda of the author might be. It's kind of linguistic philosophy. And Rav Hutner was far, far ahead of me in writing this, even though he managed perfectly well without a PhD in anything at all. Now, Rav Yitzchok Hutner talks about academic discussions of this sort. He uses an example about the planks of the Mishkan. So there's a discussion in the Talmud about whether the planks of the Mishkan were made to be straight, i.e. they were prisms, rectangular prisms, or whether they tapered towards the top. And the Talmud discusses it and tries to bring various textual proofs and record a disagreement in this matter. And you might think, well, what on earth does that mean? We can't find out. It doesn't matter. We're not about to build the Mishkan. What's that for? So Rav Hutner makes the following observation. There were many things that were concealed in Jewish history. Nignazu haluchos. The tablets of stone were concealed. At some point in Jewish history, they were lost to history. Jewish narrative has it that these items were deliberately concealed when the first temple looked like it was going to be destroyed. The Mishkan itself was eventually concealed. The Oren, the Ark, in the second temple era, there was no Ark. The high priest, Kohen Gadol, just went into an empty room on the Kodesh Kadoshim on Yom Kippur. Every concealment, not just a physical concealment, but a conceptual concealment, has a value. It teaches us something about the Jewish world and about how we understand the Torah. And this is what Rav Hutner contributes to this discussion. It is why I chose this as the topic. Because as he says, just as it is possible to, I'm going to move the text up a bit, so just as it is possible to conceal an object, you can hide an ark in a catacomb beneath Jerusalem. You can also conceal knowledge and awareness. And he goes on, it's quite a long piece, and I've culled most of it. It is possible not just to hide a physical object, but to also conceal a concept. So he points out that when there is no practical import, when I read the text about the Menorah, or I read the text about the planks with which they constructed the Mishkan, in our current world, there is no practical import to this discussion at all. So what's it for? Because the idea, the knowledge about exactly how they were was lost. We don't have any photographs. We don't have any eyewitness accounts. And there aren't going to be any. So what is the purpose of this exercise? So he says it's to help us reevaluate the very purpose of studying the Torah and the very purpose and the very concept of truth when it comes to studying the Torah. Right? The purpose of studying the Torah is to delve more deeply into the will of God. The Torah has its own truth. It has a dimension of reality, which for those who study it becomes part of their reality. We are trying through learning and studying the Torah to align ourselves more fully and more comprehensively with the will of God. And that is a type of truth, which means that there's an interpretive truth, which is part of the world of Torah. And ultimately, as Rav Hutner says, the purpose of studying these ideas, and I put it a little bit of a translation here at the bottom. I've translated the last bit quite more fully. When two Talmudic sages disagree over how the planks of the Mishkan were made, that disagreement should be explained as follows. How is the form of the planks of the Mishkan revealed to us now? Meaning, what's the most obvious, most compelling reading of the text? I.e., if I was given this text purely on which to base my construction of the plank, how would I make it? They're not disagreeing about what it looked like in the past because they couldn't have known. They're not disagreeing about what information they used to base it, maybe some tradition, maybe it wasn't like either. It's not dependent at all on what it was actually like. Our discussion is not what the Menorah was really like. It's about what the text teaches us. It's about what we can learn from the text, about what's the most compelling read of the text. As Rav Hutler says beautifully, and he writes in his beautiful Hebrew, this disagreement amongst the early sages about what the shape of the planks of the Mishkan were like, and so too in our discussion about the shape of the Menorah, he catered olenu lidrosh. How does it, as it were, devolve upon us to expound es hapsukim hadonim b'inyan zeh, the verses that address this issue? Mipnei shedroshes hapsukim eitzel Torah shebal peh hu rutzon shamochom, because utilizing all of our powers through the instruments of the oral Torah, our interpretive methodology, what I might call a hermeneutical process, that's what God wants us to do. That's the purpose. And there are many, many passages in the Torah, including the Menorah, which have no practical import. They talk about rules or a world or a history or laws that may never have any purpose again and certainly have no purpose now. What is the purpose of this? Why do we spend time delving into it? Because aligning ourselves and understanding how the text speaks to us, the most obvious way to read the text, that is the will of God. That's part of the endeavor of learning Torah and what makes us Jews. As he says with this iconic phrase, which actually citing the Talmud itself, Ve'elu heim divrei Elokim chayim. Both opinions amount to the words of the living God because they are both credible readings of the text, even though the Menorah could have only been made in one way, and perhaps in neither way. Perhaps they've both got it wrong, and it didn't look like that at all. And maybe even more radically, it doesn't matter. You could make it according to either. What matters is the process of understanding why God might want us to make it like this. How did the text speak to us? How do these ideas speak to our world? In our case, how we might make a Menorah for Chanukah. And so I finished this series on a rather unusual place. The notion of Torah Shebal Peh, the notion of human agency in interpreting the law and making it viable and accessible to human beings, is very much part of the story of Chanukah. Because the division between the human and spiritual world was very much the center of the disagreement between the Hellenists and the Jews who fought against them, and the victory of the Chashmonaim, which we celebrate on Chanukah. Our idea is that human agency is critical to the spiritual experience, and how we learn to understand and interpret the Torah is very much part of that. And as such, our celebration of Chanukah goes together with improving and enhancing our understanding of why we learn Torah, what we do with passages that have no immediate import, and the fact that we are engaging and aligning ourselves with the will of God and become part of the process and narrative of a historic chain that goes back right into the midst of time, of which we are building the next block for the future. Wishing you a Freilich and Chanukah, and do join me again in the future. Thank you.